Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I have to apologize. I've only got 2 measly slides to show you today. It was a bit of a rushed operation to get here and to take part in this incredibly important and historical summit. So yes, my name is Liz Bonnin. I'm a wildlife and natural history science presenter. And about 2 years ago, I was working on a project, a documentary about plastic pollution in our oceans. So I spent about a year researching the extent of the problem, just how bad the problem had become ever since back in the 70s. Scientists began to flag up that with this large-scale production of plastic, we could be heading for an environmental hazard. So we traveled the world and met different scientists along the way who were working to find out just how serious the marine plastic problem had become. And from making that program to today, well, actually, as I was making the program, lots of questions were coming into my head that needed to take the conversation further for me. I wanted to know how I could play a part in mitigating this crisis and how, as a communicator, I could help to communicate that as well. So since the program went out, I have such a fire in my belly, and I give a lot of talks on the ground now at science festivals and at schools to try and help communicate how I've continued trying to inform myself. So I'm very much here wanting to learn as much as I can and then hoping to disseminate that information as well to the public. So plastic, we know, is everywhere. It's reached all corners of our blue planet. We were in the Arctic with a team of scientists who were investigating just how prevalent microplastics were throughout the whole Arctic marine food web. And they knew at this point when we joined them that zooplankton, the tiny microorganisms at the base of food webs that feed the entire food chains, were ingesting plastic. They also knew that mussels, everywhere they sampled mussels had microplastics in them. And when we joined them, they were sampling the feces of walruses to see how far up each of the chains in the food web the microplastics was traveling. And basically what they found is that in the Arctic, which was once presumed to be one of the most pristine places on Earth, untouched by pollution or plastics, has one of the highest concentrations of microplastics in the world, and that from zooplankton to mussels to walruses, from zooplankton to fish to seals to polar bears, or from seals to humans, microplastics were everywhere. And the repercussions to the health of that marine ecosystem are still being unraveled and could be catastrophic, not least because of the toxic chemicals that are in and on these plastic particles. We then moved on to Southeast Asia, a place called the Coral Triangle. It's home to half of the world's corals, and it's a place that's already under tremendous stress from global warming, from warming oceans, bleaching corals. And the scientists there were discovering that the bits of plastic floating in the oceans were acting as little disease-carrying rafts. All the nooks and crannies on the plastic were encouraging the bacteria that's normally present in benign concentrations in the water column. They were allowing those bacteria to proliferate and concentrate. And then as they settled onto the coral, they were delivering these toxic loads of bacteria onto the coral. And then the coral would advance across, the bacteria would then advance across the coral, leaving a dead band of white coral in its wake, a bit like gangrene spreads across skin. And they, to date, have studied about 125,000 corals, and they found that when plastic is present, the risk of disease increases from 4% to 89%. So the full scope of the destructive power of plastics in our oceans is only being uncovered. But while in Southeast Asia, we wanted to investigate where all this plastic was coming from, we know that half of the 8 million tons a year of plastic that enters our ocean comes from rivers, and 8 of the 10 most polluted rivers in the world are in Southeast Asia. So we took a look at the Chitterum on the island of Java, and as we arrived on the Chitterum, this raft, a mile long and stretching from bank to bank, was flowing down the river. And in the middle of that mess were fishermen who used to fish for their livelihoods, now picking off bits of dirty plastic that they could hopefully sell in order to put food on the table. And that was one of the most difficult interviews I've ever had to conduct, speaking to these young men who are resigned to do this for a living. And what I found really interesting was when the program went out, a lot of people on social media reacted by saying, well, it's Southeast Asia's problem. Clearly, they're the biggest polluters of plastic. They need to sort their stuff out. It's not our fault. But very quickly, when you investigate how much we contribute as a global species to the problem, you find that in the UK alone, of the 3 million tons of plastic packaging that's collected every year, we only recycle, in big inverted commas, because we all know about the recycling myth now, about 9%. Half is sent to be incinerated or to landfill, and the rest is sold to developing countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, like Vietnam. And when you look at the issue globally, of the 8.3 billion tons of plastic that have been manufactured to date, 91% haven't been recycled. How much of that ends up in Southeast Asia on illegal dump sites? I don't know. I'm sure you saw the reports of the illegal dump sites in Malaysia that contained plastic waste from the UK, from Japan, from Ireland, from France, from Spain. This is undoubtedly a global issue. So that's what I'm at pains to tell the public now. This is not somebody else's fault. We're all responsible. And then, of course, this isn't just an ocean problem. That's become abundantly clear in the last few years. I remember speaking to Stephanie Wright, who spoke this morning when we were researching the documentary, and one fact that stays with me is you can be presented with a plate of mussels that you're going to tuck into, and you know there are microplastics in those mussels, but you're actually ingesting more plastic from the air that you breathe and the dust that settles on those mussels. So when, as communicators, we try to spread that information, very quickly you see responses from certain parts of the world and not from others. The UK actually has been doing pretty well. The public really rallied round to try and change their plastic habits, as have people in Scandinavia and other parts of the world as well. But you've got to have a look at places like the USA, where plastic is just so pervasive and there's not that kind of awareness. And in developing countries, people, and it's been mentioned this morning, just don't have the luxury of finding alternatives or acting in the same way as the West can. But certainly in the UK, there have been a lot of campaigns that involve changing your habits, change your toothbrush, change your dental floss, use reusable cups, don't use single-use plastic items as much as you can. And also as communicators, we help to encourage writing a letter to your member of parliament, asking for a ban on exports of plastic waste or asking for a ban of all single-use plastic, and then pressing send every single week until, if each and every one of us did that, can you imagine the kind of response that you would get? We also encourage, if you really want those organic vegetables, but they only come in plastic packaging, buy them and then return the packaging to the supermarket customer service or at the till with a big smile on your face. And that's gone some way in making a difference. But we know that it's not enough. So as well as that, retailers in some ways have been making some changes. All too slow for me, all too incremental for me, but there are plastic-free aisles, the first of which was established here in Amsterdam, of course. There are also plastic-free fruit and veg aisles popping up in certain supermarkets in the UK and around Europe, and then refill shops are becoming more and more popular, slowly but surely. So that is promising as well. But what's become very clear is different countries are doing different things, especially when it comes to legislation. So, for example, in the UK, there's a discussion about putting a tax on plastics, single-use plastics that have less than 30% recycled plastic in them. Meanwhile, Costa Rica is planning to ban all single-use plastic by 2021. Plastic knows no borders in the oceans, so it's no use the UK still selling its plastic waste to Southeast Asia for it to end up in our oceans, and then Costa Rica doing more than that. That's not going to solve the crisis. So on a more global level, there have been moves. For example, the European Parliament are saying they're going to ban some single-use plastic items like cotton buds and stirrers and plastic cutlery by 2025. The G20 countries signed this kind of framework where on a voluntary basis they would sort of pass projects and legislation to clean up the oceans. But critics of those types of moves are saying you're not really tackling the problem at the core, are you? You're looking to clean up the mess, but not to drastically cut the production of plastic in the first place. So all of this is sort of quite frustrating for me as a communicator, because I'm trying to keep everyone informed about what's happening, but what I'm getting from the public is I feel more helpless than ever because I'm trying to do my bit, but I don't see big enough change fast enough happening. And the big problem is that at the production level, the plastic keeps coming. So at the moment, we're producing about 400 million tons of plastic every single year, and that's set to increase to 800 million tons by 2040. And in the USA, for example, that's thanks in no small part to the fracking boom. So shale gas is really cheap, and they're making plastic, and the graphs just keep on going up. And with that continued growth is the concern about climate change. The contribution of the plastics industry alone will equate to 615 coal-fired power plants in about 30 years' time. And that equates to about 13 to 15% of all of our global carbon emissions just from the plastics industry. So with all of that, it's hard for me as a communicator to kind of cut through the noise and to know what to tell the public who are hungry for more solutions faster. And it's sort of why when I was approached by Plastic Planet to do a urine test to find out how many of these toxic chemicals I have in my system, I jumped at the chance. I was weirdly really eager for my urine to show up all the chemicals as quickly as possible. So I got the results. And I won't break everything down, but basically, when I saw this and Annelies talked me through it, it was extremely sobering, because this is real for me now. These chemicals are in my system. I have phthalates, I have bisphenol A, and different versions of phthalates. The most important ones are actually the DHP and the butyl phthalate and bisphenol A. They are all on the list of chemicals of most concern on the European Chemical Agency list. The good news, if there's good news, is that they are actually present in my system in quite low concentrations. But the bad news is these chemicals are known to cause damage in such low concentrations. So there was a bit of good news suddenly followed by a crashing realization of what's happening to me in my body. So very quickly, bisphenol A is known to be added to plastics that are rigid and that are clear. So we're talking water bottles, we're talking plastic tableware, and also containers. And they're also in the protective coating of aluminium cans, right? That's thin plasticky coating inside of those drinks cans. And we know that BPA leaches into food from these materials. So while air and dust and water are other possible sources of BPA, researchers now believe that the biggest source of exposure for us is through our diet, is through the containers that hold our food and our drink. And when it comes to phthalates, well, they're known as plasticizers, which means they make plastic more malleable, more flexible, more resilient, more easy to handle. And it's thought again that the main source is from our diet. And that's because 90% of phthalates are used to make PVC, and about 500,000 tons of PVC are made in Europe alone every single year. And the main application of that is films. So rigid films, or also more thin films like cling film. So again, it's thought that we're getting it from the films that wrap our food, but also through industry. So the pipes through which the milk flows in the factories, or the gloves that are used by food manufacturers as they're preparing food, etc. That's where we're getting our phthalates. And the test indicates that I am exposed to these constantly. And even though I'm exposed and then I excrete, and they're doing their damage in a short space of time, because of the constant exposure, they're basically causing constant damage. They're affecting my hormones. They're known as endocrine disruptors. So they affect my hormone function, but they're also toxic to reproduction in lots of different ways, including there's a link being made to fetal abnormalities. And it is, I have a fire in my belly, as I explained, so I was super keen to shout it from the rooftops that I have this, to hopefully help to propel the change that's needed. But my gosh, it is scary to know the harsh reality. This is in my body. So it just proves how omnipresent plastic chemicals are. There is simply too much in the environment for us to avoid it. So As a member of the public, but also as a communicator, there are three things that I really hope is going to happen as a result of a test like this one, but also as a result of this summit. And the first is, I really want this to be, finally, the tipping point. I want this to be the final straw that causes real change at policy level and at industry level. What else needs to happen? Before it was, well, the oceans are suffering, it's not really about us, all the while misunderstanding completely that if the oceans are suffering, our health will suffer, our health will fail too. But we didn't listen, industry carried on, business as usual. I want this to be the tipping point, as I'm sure all of you do at this summit today. The other thing I really will call for as a result of this test, for me personally, is more funding into this research. How is it that there isn't enough funding for all of these researchers basically researching what we're calling the tobacco of our generation? And the last thing is, let's talk about this until people are sick of us. Shout it from the rooftop, share it on social media, make sure we get as much media coverage as possible so that this isn't forgotten about in ways we know too well can happen when it comes to battling big industry and policy that needs to change so urgently. Thank you very much.